I'm Alana, and my pronouns are they and them.
And I'm Jessie. My pronouns are she and her.
And
we're Making
Making
Mensches. Making Mensches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Welcome to Embodied Resistance. Thank you so much for being here on your Sunday afternoon. We are so excited about this event and being able to talk with you all. Just to introduce myself, my name is Alana. I use they, them pronouns, and I am one half of Making Mensches. I'll let the rest of the panelists introduce themselves as well.
I'm Jessie. I'm the other half of Making Mensches. I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, I'm Leilah Feinstein. I am a stripper, sex worker, musician, and journalism student. I run a multimedia support platform for sex workers and femmes called A Stripper's Guide.
Hey all, I'm Ayelet. I'm a go-go dancer and a Jewish educator, and I research Jewish language eroticas out of Massachusetts. I'm based in New York these days.
I also just want to note we're a panel that's like mostly white people. And so we're talking about a conversation that impacts people from all different races in very different ways. And we can only speak to our lived experience. We can only share about our experiences in the world with our position on them. Jessie and I are talking specifically about how Jewish text and Judaism interacts with sex work. And that is the lens that we are going to take on our conversation. We just want to highlight that on the top. Let's get into our actual panel content. So some of you might be here wondering, like, how do these things connect? And how is Judaism threading together with sex work, threading together with queerness and anti-Zionism? Because all of these things are like really big topics and ideas that we're drawing together in one place. And all these things do connect together. There are people who hold all of these identities. There are people who hold some of these identities. And Judaism does talk about sex work in the Torah and in the Talmud. And there's some really interesting, juicy tidbits on how people have reflected on that in the Talmud and in conversations like modern commentary on the Torah. Just to highlight, in modern commentary on the Torah, a lot of people make the mistake of conflating sex work and sexual violence or abuse. This is a common conflation and misconception in general, outside of even just Torah commentary, of course, that is often weaponized against sex workers. We want to make very clear this is not a workshop on sexual violence. This is a workshop on sex work and liberation. So we won't be talking about sexual violence because it's not relevant to our topic that we're covering in this workshop. We centered today's workshop around the holiday of Tu B'Av, which in modern times has been oversimplified to be a Jewish Valentine's Day. It's used as a time for matchmaking and weddings. It's very lovey-dovey and sweet. This is a very diluted interpretation of the original holiday, which is a little bit more complex and kind of fascinating. In the Talmud, which is commentary on the Torah, it is talked about as this day that unmarried women would dress in white and go and dance in the vineyards because it also marked the beginning of the grape harvest. And they would do this to find a husband. There is commentary that says that wealthy women would lend their white clothing to less wealthy women, and that people were finding partners based on their character, not their appearance during this time. It comes just 6 days after the most sad and grief-filled day in Judaism, Tisha B'Av. So it really has this hopefulness and promise of joy that comes out of grief and the fact that we can move through grief and see joy as a community together. The Talmud says, again, this is the Torah commentary, that there are no holy days in Judaism that are as happy as Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur. This is interesting for a lot of people who might know about Judaism. Yom Kippur is not often thought of as a very joyful holiday, but it is the some people would argue, like the most important holiday in Judaism. Like people are showing out on Yom Kippur to really process their past year and enter the new year and atone and ask for forgiveness. And so for Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur to be compared in this way, it really highlights that this holiday is deeply important and the joy in the holiday is deeply important. And I think, yeah, I think we need to move beyond just the matchmaking and think about the importance of like love and community being so central. The fact that it is one of the happiest, one of two of the happiest days in the Jewish calendar. Just a little tidbit that I think really relates to how we've been thinking about Tu B'Av that is really fascinating is that in the early 1900s, a seamstress in Krakow named Sarah Schneerer, really hope I'm saying her name right, opened a school for Orthodox girls. This was the start of the Beit Yaakov movement, which is this network of ultra-Orthodox schools for girls. But at its start, when she began it, it was actually quite revolutionary. Um, and there's documentation of them honoring Tu B'Av by walking through the forest in the moonlight, hand in hand, lighting a bonfire, and singing and dancing around this bonfire together. One of the young girls in the school gave a speech at this event and claims that this holiday belongs to women, to young Jewish women specifically. In this celebration of a holiday and their celebration of a holiday, the young women could dance without the male gaze and dance for themselves together in their community. The language about women, maybe we can update that for where we're at. This can really be for all of us, but I think this really moves it beneath its surface level interpretation. It's a time to commune with nature, share joy and love with our community. It reminds us to take care of each other, to walk hand in hand in the forest together, and that we all deserve to love and be loved. And we're taking this Tu B'Av to honor our sex worker community and push for the right for all of us to be liberated enough to dance safely together.
Thank you for that incredible background on Tu B'Av, Alana. I'm going to give us a very short background on sex work in Torah and Jewish texts because our incredible panelists are going to be speaking more in depth on this in a little bit. But just for background, as Alana brought up before, sex work is mentioned in the Torah many times, but what we're not talking about is sexual manipulation and sex trafficking or abuse. So for anybody whose first thought was like, oh, Tamar, like me when I first started researching this, that's actually not sex work being performed. And we could talk more about what Tamar is trying to accomplish in Genesis and why it works out this way. But that is not what today's panel is on. And then, of course, Sarah is another woman in the Torah who has an interesting encounter with a pharaoh, and Abraham makes an interesting choice. That is also not about sex work. So let's move beyond that and let me get into a little bit more about when sex work is explicitly named in the Torah. So Leviticus 21:9 straight up tells us that the daughters of priests who choose sex work will be severely punished. And the Talmud actually debates what this punishment should be, but there's also a debate over how the status of the woman impacts her punishment. Is it only a married woman? Is it a betrothed woman? What about the women who are not priest daughters? What is their punishment? And all of this obsession, this focus really culminates in the Talmud, where in Sanhedrin 49b18, they say the reason why this transgression or this like act is considered so great, so awful is because the sin impacts her father. So it's about shaming your father. And this idea that sex work from this perspective of shaming men is not a feminist interpretation, or is not like, oh, well, at least they weren't harming sex workers in this way. There's no way to spin this in a way that like the Torah was feminist and saying it's actually okay to do sex work. We're not here to defend the Torah and be like, everything that's in the Torah is directly applicable to like a positive feminist view of sex work. So I just want to get that out like straight up. The first time we're encountering sex work explicitly named in the Torah is not from this incredible light where like it feels super positive. However, in the same section of Leviticus, we're also told that we should not gash our bodies, which has been translated to not getting tattoos. And it's also said that men are not allowed to cut their hair or beards. Obviously, we don't live by those rules in Leviticus today. So if you encounter any people who are using the Torah to justify any of these beliefs about sex work, it might be helpful to remind them the other facts that are popping up in Leviticus around the exact same portion. Later in Jewish texts like Joshua and Judges, there is a normalization of sex work, but primarily with groups of people who are not Jewish. So once again, another reminder that Jews were not in isolation for most of Jewish texts. They were living amongst many groups of people, and sex work was very common. In Isaiah, Kings, and Proverbs, sex workers are mentioned as part of Jewish society. They're hanging out, playing music in the streets, they're bathing publicly. It's very much that sex workers have always been a part of Jewish society, dating back to our most ancient texts. Another talking point in case anyone tries to tell you differently. Today, sex work in Jewish communities is complicated. As Alana explained earlier about the conflation between human trafficking and sex work and how that's not what the focus of our panel is today, there are Jewish organizations that are supposedly quote unquote dedicated to the rights of sex workers and are actually operating in a way that primarily focuses on human trafficking and greatly conflates that dangerous conflation again of sex trafficking and sex work and making it seem like all sex work is oppressive and violating people, and therefore these people need to be saved. And this savior mentality we're going to talk about a little bit more as well. But some of these organizations, the American Jewish World Service and L'Chaim, which operates out of the Czech Republic, they collaborate often with law enforcement, which we're going to talk about later, how that is problematic as well. But just keep in mind, if you see some of these organizations that claim to be operating on behalf of sex workers, you have to be really mindful that a lot of them are co-opting this movement in order to misrepresent it as a savior or like kind of rescue operation, and often not empowering or working with sex workers themselves who are having these conversations. Okay, that was a lot of information. And now we're going to move into a little bit more information, and then we're going to hear from our awesome panelists.
Thanks, Jessie. I think that context is so important. And as always, you are literally so good at breaking down the Torah. I'm always in awe of you. If people have questions on like where some of this content is and want resources, we are happy to send some links out after. So we'll just do that. You don't have to ask for it. We will send links out after. I'm saying it now. As Jesse's talking about, a lot of Jewish organizations that claim to be doing work related to sex work actually are focusing on things that are not sex work, like human trafficking and sexual violence. This is also what happens in Israel. We're here talking about anti-Zionism. It's important to talk about the ways that Israel weaponizes sex work. While we are talking about sex work, not sexual violence, it's also important to note the myriad of ways that Zionists in Israel weaponize sex. Not only is Israel's view on sex work and sex workers paternalistic, but they also use sexual violence as a weapon against Palestinians. We have seen this come up so many times in the last few months. There are a lot of really well-researched reports that have come out about this. And I really encourage all of you to understand that this is happening and understand that the conversation we are having is, again, not about sexual violence. However, when we're thinking about how sex workers are impacted in Israel, often the sex workers that are impacted the most adversely by the laws and rules and regulations are Palestinian sex workers, queer sex workers, other sex workers of color, as stands globally. Before we get into where Israel falls in this conversation, I wanted to break down the differences between legalization and decriminalization. This is a really important nuance to understand when it comes to talking about sex work, because these words mean two very different things. Legalizing something is like creating a set of laws, regulations, and then when it's related to sex work, this can be related to people who buy or sell sex. And so people who do this outside of those laws and regulations are then breaking the law. So those laws and regulations can be very specific, and it ends up that often most sex work falls outside of these rules and regulations anyway, and is therefore still criminalized. With decriminalization, it just basically means that consenting adults who buy or sell sex are not committing a crime. Full stop. There's not a specific set of rules and regulations that people need to follow. It's a general decriminalization of sex work. We can think about this when it comes to a lot of different topics, like when we think about use of cannabis. Cannabis is legalized, not decriminalized. If it was decriminalized, it would mean across the board people could use cannabis and there would be nothing they would have to worry about. But with legalization, different places have different rules or regulations on how weed is distributed or used or who sells it or where it's allowed to be sold. Legalization is harmful. It does not ensure sex workers' health or safety or autonomy. Most sex workers are unwilling or unable to work under legalization. For example, in the US, the only place sex work is legalized is in Nevada, and this system really demonstrates a lot of the problems with legalization. Most of the laws are at the expense of sex workers and end up profiting brothel owners in Nevada and taking a lot of money away from sex workers and also like harming their physical safety, their health. Legalization is really couched in this idea of saviorism. So this saviorism that comes through with legalization is happening very explicitly in Israel. Israel legalized sex work in 1949, but only for heterosexual sex work, question mark. And then in 1954, they legalized all forms of sex work. And then in 2021, they kind of shifted on this a bit and they passed a temporary law that enforces a complete ban on sex work. This ban is really interesting and is so enmeshed in a savior complex. It focuses so much on like rescuing sex workers and criminalizing or rehabilitating clients. And it really, as a lot of laws do, blur the lines between trafficking and sex work. Part of the requirement of the law is that Israel offers rehabilitation to sex workers and the option of treatment for offenders or clients of sex workers. As it turns out, it's 2024, this started in 2021. A lot of these programs have not been carried out. Only about roughly 200 sex workers estimated have actually been involved in these programs. And there are obviously massive problems with the program. Like sex workers don't need to be rehabilitated, like full stop. They're just doing their job. And so also in the creation of the law in general, most people who are actually involved in sex work were not asked. Like there's nothing about trans sex workers, nothing about undocumented sex workers, nothing about Palestinian or queer sex workers. These people are also completely excluded from the services offered in the rehabilitation program. So even from like this savior mindset, these sex workers with these like intersecting identities are not even considered, not even thought of, and not even provided for, even in this model of saviorism that they're trying to make work. This savior mindset is really interesting and also reflects a lot of Zionist historical attitudes towards sex workers. So I want to turn it over to Ayelet to get into some of this Zionist savior history.
Thank you so much, Elena and Jesse. It's really great to be here. I research Hebrew language erotica from around the first 10 years of the establishment of a Zionist state in Palestine. I was taught in my academic training to make the most important point first because people stop paying attention eventually. So what I'd like to speak to today is the fact that for liberation and Palestinian liberation aren't interreliant because there are people who hold sex worker and anti-Zionist identities simultaneously as individuals, that they're interreliant because the mechanisms that are fueling whorephobia and Zionism are respectively and collectively rooted in paternalistic saviorism. So that's a lot of words, and I'd like to unpack them with the use of these three images. We're going to start with the black and white. This was a photo taken by Paul Goldman, who you might not have heard of, but if you encountered any Zionist indoctrination in your childhood, like Jewish day school or Hebrew school, or just a really pushy yenta at synagogue, you probably saw a photo that Paul Goldman took of David Ben Gurion doing a headstand on the beach. He was kind of famous for capturing early Zionist colonization efforts. So his photos are very distinctly sort of Zionist propaganda oriented. So children with guns, farmers with guns, a lot of colonizers with guns. And this photo stood out to me when I first encountered it. It was published in 1945 with the caption, "A female prisoner of the Ravensbrück concentration camp with the inscription Feldhor," which is field whore, on her chest. And underneath is a number. This photo struck me because it didn't really seem to have any of the hallmarks of a Zionist propaganda piece. Um, it was published as a photo taken in the land called Nahalal. This land was the Arab village of Ma'alul, which was tended by the Lebanese Sursouk family until the Zionist Palestine Land Development Company colonized it in 1921. Um, in researching this image in particular, I found about half a dozen Holocaust historians attesting to the fact that it was staged. So all of this narrative really struck me as distinctly propaganda oriented, and it really brings us back to Alana's point about saviorism, that the narrative set forth by an image like this is that a woman was forced into a life of whoredom by her diasporic settings, that she was relegated to the ultimate degradation, which is engagement with some sort of sex work or whoreness, either in the job description or the moral judgment, and was saved by relocation to a Zionist state. This was prior to the establishment of a formal colony in Palestine, but nevertheless certainly served to bolster this notion that the state of Israel exists to save women like the subject of this photo. I think that we've been hearing a lot of savioristic narratives surrounding Jews in the diaspora. Joe Biden saying that without Israel, every Jew in the world would be at risk. And I think that folks who have engaged with sex work or just gotten into Twitter arguments with the SWers have certainly heard this narrative that the ultimate orientation for someone who cares about sex workers is to be in a salvationary position to get them out of the relegation to sex work. And that really brings us to the coalescing of these narratives, the mutual magnitude of this impetus to save the whores and the Zionist notion that Jews are in need of salvation. There are two other images here, both of which include this picture. And I just want to get a little bit into the Zionist myth making that's happened over the past 80 odd years. So here in the middle is novella erotica published by a Polish-Israeli Zionist author, which, similarly to this photo, tells the story of a Jewish whore in the diaspora who sort of fell victim to the powers that be, was relegated into prostitution, and though she herself isn't saved by the existence of a Zionist state, the author became a prominent Zionist, and the sort of narrative surrounding this novel's publication, despite it being this Lord erotica, was that he was able to escape this kind of life of depravity through the existence of a Zionist state. And here on the other end, perhaps scariest of all, is this original image being shown to Elon Musk and Ben Shapiro as sort of testament of fact while on their tour of Auschwitz earlier this year. So we can really see the narrative forming of this faked propaganda piece becoming a part of legitimized history. So this is maybe the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. when it comes to thinking through the ways in which erotica has served to bolster the present colonial power that is the state of Israel. I think my takeaway from all of this is that by positioning itself as a savior force, the Zionist state is able to sort of paternalistically designate and dictate what entities are oppressors. And I think that's something that sex workers are extremely familiar with. It's the same mechanism under which, like, the New York Human Trafficking Intervention Court, where you go if you're taken in for something that they don't call sex work in New York, also offers sort of counseling services and job retraining services and all these sort of reorienting savioristic structures with the ultimate goal of imposing a normalized way of being onto an individual. And I think that that's something that is absolutely prominent in the contemporary Zionist narratives. We're hearing that Zionism is being positioned as a salvationary source rather than as an oppressive one, particularly to American Jews. So I know that's all a lot to contend with, but I think that in terms of thinking through why it is all the more so vital to have these conversations collectively and not consider for liberation and Palestinian liberation as sort of uh, issues that orbit one another, but issues that are interreliant, is because the fact that when these oppressions come together, they do hold this tremendous magnitude. You know, the staying power of an image like this makes it all the more so tremendously vital to recognize these mirroring oppressive mechanisms and then cast them off collectively rather than considering them mutually exclusive issues of anti-oppression.
Ayelet, that was amazing. Is there anything you want to add in before Leilah takes over?
Yeah, I can maybe speak a little bit to just the myth making element of this all. So in the image that we saw of, sorry, I didn't warn anyone that I was going to show a picture of Elon Musk. I know that was probably scary. The figure standing next to him was Rabbi Menachem Margolin, who's the chairman of the European Jewish Association, and also recently called for a mass exodus of Jews to occupied Palestine. So in all of this, I think maybe the takeaway for particularly Jews consuming media about this, for anyone who gives a shit about liberation consuming media, is that there is an element of myth making. And for folks who are unlearning Zionist education that was passed on to them, and for folks who are sort of trying to create a foundation of liberatory knowledge and anti-Zionist fact, which is certainly a challenge to undertake, that there is a propaganda machine that's been in motion for many decades more than we've been alive. And that's all the more so why I think liberatory movements need to be co-reliant, because it's been my presence in sex worker spaces that has really made me understand paternalism and saviorism, and, like, you know, having talks with that one strip club customer who, like, wants to save you from this place is the same kind of mental mechanism that's going on in the whole narrative of that image. So hopefully that speaks to the co-reliance of our liberation, and I think we all have a part in that.
Thank you for tying those threads together. It's so weird to see that image on a piece of paper being held by Elon Musk in Auschwitz. It almost sounds like an AI generated nightmare. Like, I don't know how all of those things came together. I do know, because we live in a horrible time, but it's so weird and just icky and scary more than anything. So thank you for tying that all together, because if I had seen that, I wouldn't have known what that image was, and I would have been very confused. And it really does center, like, everything is meeting here together and all of it is intertwined. So thank you so much for breaking that down. I want to invite Leilah to come into the conversation.
I am sitting here just absorbing everything everyone is saying, and I just want to say that I really wish that I was in a room with everyone who's here, panelists and guests alike. I am autistic, and I don't normally process my emotions as they're coming up, but I'm getting really emotional in this in this talk, listening to you all and reflecting on the ways that everything everybody is saying ties into what I was planning on talking about today. So what I'm going to talk about is going to be a kind of a hard pivot left from what everybody else has talked about, but also going to come pull right back into the lanes that folks have been on. So I want to first specify that, so I've been a stripper for 10 years. I have been moving more into other forms of sex work, more full service forms of sex work over the past few years. And I want to talk about that first. And then I want to talk about my Jewish perspective on everything that I'm trying to say here. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that not everyone considers strippers sex workers. And before I ever did any other form of sex work, I still considered myself a sex worker as a stripper. And that is because it's not just about how I see myself and how I identify myself. It's very much about how I'm perceived in a patriarchal, colonialist, capitalist, racist society. The way that I am perceived affects my safety. It affects my relationships. Stigma really affects sex workers' relationships. That's actually the area that I focus on in my study. It's what I focus on in my journalism training. And I know that folks earlier talked about, this is not a conversation about sexual violence. And I really appreciate you all for separating out the difference between sex work and human trafficking, because that's a really important baseline to establish if we are to then acknowledge that sexual violence does befall sex workers as well, but it is not necessarily an inherent part of the profession. The reason that sex workers are in heightened danger has nothing to do with our profession and everything to do with our genders and identities performing the profession. And I know, Jesse, you mentioned that in the Torah, sex work is framed as something that brings shame on the men related to the presumably femme sex worker. And I think that's such a perfect illustration of the way that our society sees sex workers, sees queer people, sees trans people, femmes, women. And the closer that you are to whoredom, the more endangered you become, because you sort of lose the contest about whether your life is valid. And I am speaking all of this from the perspective of somebody who is mostly just a stripper for a long time, as somebody who is a thin cis white woman, so extremely privileged in terms of sex workers worldwide. But also, it is that positionality that called me, that really clarified for me. And I don't usually give such personal anecdotes, and that's what my whole talk here today is really going to be about, my personal perspective, but it's the only perspective I can speak from. And I think that it does illustrate what we're all trying to get to here. And when I'm thinking about sort of, this was my personal, before I was ever a sex worker, I understood very early in my early 20s that I feel called to disrupt gendered violence. And as I've grown into myself as a queer person, as a femme, as a sex worker, I'm 35 now, so it's been a while since that sort of first calling hit my heart when I was like 20. I've started to understand so much more about the way misogyny works as something that really aids and supports the arm of the state, and how the state comes into the lives of sex workers, and how the state and other institutions, whether they be religious or civil, if they are not actively working to decolonize themselves, that we are then passed on this gendered stigma, this stigma about sex workers, about gender, about sexuality, and about different identities. We get passed on those things from our institutions, whether it's school or a religious institution or whatever it may be. It's kind of ingrained into us from the beginning. And so forgive my bluntness. I don't offer trigger warnings when I'm talking about sex work or gendered violence, because I really don't, or any type of violence against marginalized people, because the folks who are at risk for that violence can't afford the privilege of a trigger warning. It just is. And when I was grappling with, whether I was allowed to call myself as a sex worker when the only thing I was performing was stripping, I came to the conclusion that what solidifies how I identify outwardly is really, how's it going to be written about if I die at work? If I get killed at work, if I don't do drugs, but what if I OD'd at work? Like, the compassion that you are eligible for if you die in the line of work as a sex worker. And that really solidified for me, like, no, I am a sex worker. Like, what matters is how people perceive me in terms of my safety. And that was during the time when I was really starting to recognize that I felt called to specifically focus on the way that stigma impacts sex workers' personal relationships. So all of that is some background that I wanted to share before I share more about myself as a Jew. Alana called me up some months ago now, inviting me into something. They just said, I want to do something that relates, Jewish identity with sex worker identity, that unites Jewish community with sex worker community and celebrates the overlap. And my first thought was like, I'm no authority for this. I am not, I'm not the right one. And I really grappled with it until earlier this summer. I was having a conversation with someone else in my life, and this just organically came up. And I realized that the way that I identify as a Jew is the same way that I identify as a sex worker. And that is as a politicized person. So I did not grow up in Jewish community. I am 1/4 Ashkenazi. My name is Leilah Feinstein. So I had this heavily identifiable Jewish identity my whole life. I grew up in a white Irish Catholic enclave of Boston. And even though I was not raised in Jewish community, I wasn't raised in much. I was, extremely secular, not much Jewish tradition to speak of, not much tying me to myself culturally. But the one thing that was instilled in me from the time I was like a baby is Jewish morality. And I have always considered myself Jewish, even when most people tell me I'm not. I cannot change the way that I see myself in that way. I can't change my experiences. I can't change knowing that since I was as young and small as I can remember, this has been something that has felt so central to who I am. And through our culture, our American culture that prioritizes, Ashkenazi narratives of Jewishness, and conveniently, normalizes Jewishness as inseparable from the state of Israel. What was trickling down to me through the zeitgeist was a very, what I consider, anti-Semitic stereotypical narrative about what a Jew is. And I knew that it was in contrast to how I felt myself as Jewish, because the central core value that was taught to me by my Jewish family is that above all else, it is a Jewish duty to stand up for folks experiencing oppression, whether that is folks who are standing right next to you or folks continents away. I have always felt that being Jewish means that I don't get to look away from injustice. It doesn't feel like a choice to me. It feels like an imperative. And it's felt like that my whole life. And also, this is one of the first, I've never been on a Jewish panel. I have never been, someone who is in a position of having a microphone in a Jewish space. And I also want to acknowledge my positionality here in being someone who was pretty far removed from any Jewish community and somebody who is white and European in non-Jewish ways. And that I know I'm Jewish. I have felt proudly and spiritually Jewish my whole life, but I've been very cautious about claiming that identity in Jewish circles because I also want to respect that there are experiences that I haven't had. And I also, I feel intimidated and strange here in this group claiming a Jewish identity. And I hope that folks here can kind of catch what I'm throwing, because I understand that a lot of Jewish people don't see me as Jewish, and that doesn't really faze me because I know how I see myself. But I also want to be mindful about the space that I take up. But also, with what is happening in the world since the creation of the State of Israel, there is no way for me to be silent as a Jew about what's happening. And when I called Alana up and I was like, I know how I can come and speak on these things, it's because I realized that being Jewish is something that is politicized, just like being a sex worker is something that is politicized. There is a way that I am seen in the world generally, that if I am not contending with Zionism as a propaganda project, I can excuse my duty to speak up for Palestinian rights as a Jew. And if I accept that my identity as a Jew has been politicized in ways that I am not okay with, because it excuses and licenses me to oppress other people because I'm Jewish, that is not a Jewishness that I am willing to accept for myself, just because our wider pro-Zionist society is telling me that that is how I have to be a Jew. I know that's all nuanced but the major point that I felt myself that day, it was the first time in my life, that day when I was having that conversation with a friend, and I realized that the way that I feel Jewish, like, yes, I have my own spiritual relationship to God, and even though I haven't been studying Jewish scripture my whole life, like, I am Jewish, so I know that my relationship to God is Jewish. And I've found such wonderful queer anti-Zionist community here in New York that is starting to reflect me back to myself and make me understand that that this is a valid way to be. But when I was having that conversation with a friend and said out loud for the first time and realized out loud for the first time that for me being Jewish is a political identity, it made me realize that that's exactly how I feel about being a sex worker. And it made me finally able to kind of step into the place that I feel my identities meeting in a way that is relevant in a community setting. And so what I want to end on is what really sunk in for me that day is this notion that a politicized identity is a sign of oppression, right? Like if sex workers weren't oppressed, if femmes and queer people and women weren't oppressed, if Jews did not have our own history of oppression, then these would not be risk factors in my existence. And so if there's a portion of our identity that is politicized, that is that's a sign that there are forces in the world, working against that part of us, working against that demographic's ability to survive and thrive. And it's a sign of imbalance. And I really, really take it as a divine call, as a call from God that I can choose whether or not to answer. I can choose as a white person, I had never had to tell anybody I'm a sex worker. I would never have to tell anybody I'm Jewish. I could have changed my name and nobody would have been the wiser, and I could just continue on and not be at risk in those ways. But because I do sex work, because I am Jewish, even if I only had that information for myself, I can still feel the oppression. I can still feel what it means. And that to me that's a sign that I have a calling that I can answer, because we're all one. We're all reflections of God in each other as I see it. To me, that call is coming from inside the house. That call is deeper inside of me than is my own ego, than is my own consciousness. And it's really this, like, to me, more than anything, this beautiful invitation to step up and step into my humanity and figure out, what is my positionality in this? What can I do? Who can I talk to? Who sees me as human enough for me to maybe try and humanize others? And I wasn't planning on saying this, but I do just want to say, because I find this concept useful, and if anybody else here finds this useful, I think doing the work of lateral education in our communities, one thing that really helps me is thinking about, like, okay, where am I in the link in the chain? And like, who can I access? Like, I know that folks who are still, engulfed in Zionism, that's the way they were raised, that's the way they feel, that's how they see the world. It is often very difficult for me to have any type of movement in my conversations with those folks, because they can immediately write me off and tell me I'm not really Jewish and that I wouldn't understand. And it happens all the time. And so it's like, okay, Alana, can I tap you? Jesse, can I tap you? Ayelet, can I tap you? Like, who can I tap? And then, like, likewise, who can tap me? Like, where can I take my privileges and put them to use?
Leilah, thank you so much for everything that you shared. And I really want to, like, highlight and focus on what you shared about the way you feel in Jewish spaces and people invalidating your Judaism within Jewish spaces, because we come up against that all the time. And I think it is helpful to ground us in, like, Jewish values and Jewish texts. But something that Rabbi Miriam Grossman shared once on a talk about abortion that was so helpful to me was, like, yes, we look to the Jewish text for guidance, but if it didn't exist in the Jewish text to support abortion, we would still support abortion. So, like, when we use these like Jewish frameworks and things to define ourselves and our movements, like, we are Jewish enough by living by these values that we care about, period. Like, we don't have to root ourselves in this Talmud study or all of these things. And so thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing that in this space. And, like, I just want to affirm everything you're saying, that, like, you belong on this panel and you should be on 100 more panels. And I can't wait to hear all of the incredible Jewish work you're doing, because you're doing amazing work. And to speak a little to some of these Jewish texts that we are, like, using, reinterpreting, investigating, challenging, Ayelet, do you have some texts?
I do. I also was going to say the exact same Rabbi Miriam Grossman quote, so you really took that. That's okay. Mine's yeah, I teach little kids, and I feel like they often come to me with, like, really specific, like, what would the Torah say about, like, my brother stealing my Oreo? And I think it's really appealing to look for these sort of narrowly definable moralistic lessons. And I think I made that mistake while I was prepping for today, which is why I'm sort of improvising, because the text that I originally brought to share was from the Haftarah from Devarim, which, if anyone's a huge dork, will know that it was read in synagogue like 2 weeks ago. And it starts with the phrase "Ayeka hayta lezona," the sentence sort of judgment. Alas, she has become a whore, this faithful city that was filled with justice. So initially I read that and thought, what a great text to come and share with this group and think through this word whore and how it manifested as a verb to describe the act of harlotry, as a job description, as an adjective, in the same way that we hear whore used nowadays. And then a couple of days later, it was Tisha B'Av, and folks who went to synagogue heard this really just graphic and visceral narrative of the suffering that comes about when a siege is enacted and when human beings arbitrarily enact suffering onto a group of people that they decide is unworthy of basic human existence. Just huge portions of that text describe the starvation of children and the inhuman conditions that folks are subjected to under the siege of Jerusalem. And this is a suffering that Jewish people have spent 24 hours dwelling on annually and immersed themselves in the empathy of suffering to the most extreme level, the seeking out of the experience of another people's suffering. And I think that oftentimes when we turn to text, it's a means of intellectualizing or sort of, and I'm certainly guilty of doing this as well, seeking sort of guidance when I think the most forceful elements of utilization of text is when it really offers us a route towards understanding what it means to enact the experience of empathy. At the end of Tisha B'Av, the day itself is over and you're having your meal, but you're not allowed to have meat or like particularly yummy things because it's not like you've totally cast off the suffering because it still happened and you're not really allowed to leave it behind. So I think if there's anything that we're gleaning from the text that we're wrestling with, it's very Jewish to wrestle, then I think it's that enactment of suffering and not intellectualization of suffering and sort of lowest common denominator understanding rather than looking for really specific moralizations because some of it's a crock of shit or just non-applicable. Uh, don't tell my rabbi I said that.
Thank you, Ayelet. Thank you, Leilah. Thank you for bringing so much insight and wisdom to this panel. I think it's really special, and I think it's really important to unpack the way that all of these identities come together and inform each other. And thank you all for being here and listening. I think it says a lot that there are so many people who are looking for a space that's talking about all of these things at the same time. And I think that really demonstrates the importance of the event. I feel like there's not a lot of, if any, Jewish spaces that are anti-Zionist and talking about sex work in a way that's not paternalistic or savior based and is speaking from a place of like experience and truth. Especially not ones that are then also queer on top of that. And so it is meaningful to create a space like that. I want to give folks an opportunity to continue to send in some questions. I see that there are people who sent in 2 already. So I want to give our panelists who might have more insight an opportunity to answer some of these questions. Yeah, Ayelet, go ahead.
Hi. I'm just excited about the question about references to BDSM sex work in Jewish texts, or other resources that could be shared. I'm not the most knowledgeable about this. I would like to point whoever asked that question to the sort of broader narrative of Queen Ma'aka. That's spelled Maacah, which is in 1 Kings 15, and there's a whole slew of Talmudic stuff about her. I'll try to be really brief, but basically her story is that she was a queen that created a mifletzet, which is an abominable thing or like some sort of monster. Basically, she made an idol, and the idol was like a sexy lady, and she stuck a dildo on it, and she like worshipped it publicly. There's a really interesting, sorry, I know this is a podcast, but I'm gonna recommend a different podcast.
We
It's
love that.
called,
Please recommend all the
Hi,
things.
How Are You? Hi spelled with an X, and they have a whole episode on particularly the question of whether one's allowed to fill into a sex party, but they get into a whole slew of stuff. And I think it does tie back really well to the abortion quote about sort of like, uh, I think for every like sort of complementary reference to BDSM and kink in the Talmud, you'll find like 100 references to like really sex negative notions in the same way that I think there are a lot of really brilliant folks searching hard for rabbinic grounds for anti-Zionist work, sort of historically speaking, which is amazing. And at the same time, your engagement with pro-dom work as a Jewish person makes that legitimate. All that's to say, like, I think that it's amazing to try to seek out Queen Ma'aka's really awesome, and I get excited about her because she's like this weird freak that everyone hates. And also, like, that doesn't mean that that's how you should feel about being a Jew engaging with this work. Yeah, more so in a reclamatory sense, may be helpful to have this historically, like, not so lauded figure who also is a crucial ancestor and matriarch of Judaism and who did kink in public and really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Okay, the next question is how can one find community with sex workers that are not only Jewish but also lesbian and or sapphic in New York? Lila, I feel like you might have some answers for this. So
Yes, I am thinking, first thing that came to mind is sex worker open mic. The next one is Friday, September 20th at Star Bar. We haven't announced it yet, but it will be from 6 to 10 p.m. at Star Bar. And anybody here is more than welcome to come to that. I would be happy to have our MC kind of like plug that call, like, hey, looking for like queer Jewish sex workers to hang out with or chat with or, be in community with. That's what I got for answers to that. But I'm sure there's more. I just am not aware.
There's also ACT UP has meetings every Monday that are open to join. It's not exclusively a sapphic or a sex worker space, but I've found that sort of lowest common denominator, big tent organizing spaces are usually the ones that are most sex worker friendly and not like turfy. So yeah, ACT UP is doing some really consistent and forceful organizing in the city, and I think a great place to find community is by facilitating organized vandalism. So yeah, definitely their ACT UP New York on Instagram has all the information, and you can become a member and get a pin.
also, if people have resources for either of these questions who are like in the space but not on the panel, you can put them in as a question and I'll just share them as resources. Could not figure out how to change the chat function while also like keeping safety stuff down. So that feels like the best way to do that. So please, if you have resources, share them and we will share them with everyone. Um, other questions before we move on to our love letter writing portion?
Sometimes we ask people before the end of our interviews about like a piece of advice or a message that you'd like to leave all of our listeners, and in this case, Zoom participants with. So for Leilah and Ayelet specifically, and because I just sprung this and did not prepare you, you can take time or say, I don't know, I'll get back to you. But do you have a message to Jewish anti-Zionist sex workers or to people in general that you would like to leave us with?
I would just say, pay attention. I've had some friends this year who are Jewish anti-Zionist sex workers who've been grappling with how to legitimize both of those identities to people in their lives. And I think it's important, if you are both of those things, to pay attention when the cognitive dissonance overlaps both identities. Like when folks are telling you that your views about sex worker liberation, Palestinian liberation, anti-Zionism, Judaism that is beyond Zionism, when folks are trying to tell you that those perspectives are invalid, notice the ways that the invalidations could apply to any facet of your identity. Because I think that I've seen that be important for folks in my life in terms of gaining confidence and speaking up and speaking out.
Yeah, I'm so taking in so much brilliance. I think this is mostly for folks of my positionality. I'm an Ashkenazi white Jew, and I think that particularly for Jews who benefit tremendously from the privileges of whiteness who are getting involved in anti-Zionist spaces, and for folks who are engaged with sex work in non-full service or sort of less than full service settings, just folks with proximity to privilege, particularly for American Jews. I think that the Zionist entity really benefits from our self-victimization or our sort of internalization of this idea that we are in danger, and Zionism or the state in some sense will offer us salvation. I think that that's something that is not only sort of important to perpetually challenge, but also to counteract through actions and putting your body on the front lines and like physically like go stand in front of the cops at protests. I think that it's really easy to engage in anti-Zionist spaces in front of a screen and important. And at the same time, I think that acknowledging privilege has become pretty inadequate. And for folks of my positionality, ours as white people, it's important to counteract that actively by protecting our less privileged siblings. So I guess my advice is like, I don't go throw bricks at cops. Like, I don't know, don't like sort of wallowing in self-victimization and like grief over one's own privilege. It doesn't help anyone. So I don't know if there are folks listening to this or enjoying this podcast who are feeling like guilty about their positionality, but just that it's sort of an active calling to insight to the degree proportional to your privilege.
Thank you both. So incredibly important and yeah, very, very beautifully said. I, of course, am always promoting throwing more bricks at cops. So I think that's an important message for people to take away. Okay, I'm gonna move us on a little bit. So in the in-person event model, there was going to be a really beautiful love letter writing station. And this is still gonna happen, but in a different way. So stick with us. Um, Lila, if you could share some details on the love letters, what they are, where they're going, how people can share them, etc. That would be amazing.
Yeah. So basically, we had this idea in the vein of Tu B'Av and the vein of anti-Zionism as community strength, community support, a way to show community love, to have folks who are gathered here to write anti-Zionist love letters to protesters, pro-Palestinian love letters to sex workers, love letters to trans folks. And we're gonna, so at the sex worker open mic, we put up flyers around town. We wheat paste flyers before each event, and our team will take your letters and wheat paste them up all over the city. And so these, these letters come from your heart. They can be whatever you want to say in the vein of these things, but it would, just imagine that you were walking through the subway station and you suddenly came on one of these letters and it was exactly what you needed, because maybe you're feeling really isolated in your in your solidarity efforts, and maybe you don't have people in your life who are, maybe this is the only love note that sex worker is going to see that this year. And we just thought it was, it could be a nice and loving way to reach out and touch folks in our community that we may never come across in person, but to create that sort of spiritual kiss. The other thing that was going to be present today is a solidarity book that we have at the open mic, and folks can write notes in there, folks can submit art to put in there. That book is going to be taken to Cairo with the folks who are bringing the funds, and the people who are already in Cairo already know about the Solidarity book, and they're really excited to read it. But also that Solidarity book will be present at the Sex Worker Open Mic on September 20th at Star Bar from 6 to 10 p.m. So if you want to come sign it in person and just kind of mingle and meet other anti-Zionist sex workers, and it is a queer event, so it's a very, very queer-centric anti-Zionist sex worker event. So that come see us, come say hi. If you were present here today, I hope to make it to that mic. Please come say hi. I would love to meet you in person. I wish that we were meeting in person today. I really do.
Thanks, Lila. That's a great option for people who ask questions about finding this sort of community. I encourage you to go out there. I really hope all of you will take time to write some of these letters. I want to close this out, close this space, this community that we've built in this short time, with a little meditation focused on love and loving kindness for ourselves in the spirit of Tu B'Av. So I encourage you to follow along with this meditation if that feels good. I'm going to share some background music during it. So wherever you are, if you're sitting up, you're wanting to lie down, whatever you prefer, just start to bring your awareness to your breath and your body. And take a few deep breaths. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Just breathe and rest here. Continue riding the waves of your breath. However you are breathing is good. You settle into this flow of breathing, start to call to mind someone in your life who loves you, who loved you unconditionally. Give yourself over to the feelings and the qualities of their selfless love and kindness. Feel all of their love for you right here, right now, as you breathe. Settle into the warmth and radiance of their embrace of you just as you are. Drink in the experience that you are unequivocally and unconditionally loved and accepted as you are, without having to be different, without having to be worthy of their love, without having to deserve it. You may not feel particularly worthy or deserving. That does not matter. Their love is for you just as you are, for who you are now already and perhaps always have been. Allow your heart to bask in these feelings, to be cradled in them, to be rocked moment by moment, following the rhythm of your heart and the loving heart of another. Continue breathing, allowing your heart to be held in this way. This feels difficult to conjure up this person. Imagine someone treating you this way. Imagine the feelings of love and kindness and regard. Continue to really connect with how this person feels for you. Allow their feelings of love to wrap around you as a reminder that you are loved and you are worthy just as you are. When you are ready, see if you can become the source as well as the object of these feelings. Take on these feelings for yourself as if they were your own, rather than those of another. Continue sitting in your breath, in the beating of your heart, and hold your own heart with these feelings of love and acceptance and kindness. You are both the lover and the loved. Resting here in these feelings as best you can. Bathing in your own complete acceptance of yourself as you are right here in this very moment. Continue to feel love in the flow of your breath. Picturing yourself wrapped in that love and acceptance. Picturing wrapping yourself in that love and acceptance. Slowly bring awareness back to your body and the space around you, continuing to hold that love in each of your inhales and exhales every time your heart beats. You are so loved and so seen and so cared for just as you are. And whenever you're ready, you can begin to open your eyes if you've closed them. Move your body a little bit, stretch back into the space around you. Thank you all for going on that little loving journey with us. I want to thank you all again so much for being here today. This has been a really special conversation, and I'm happy we could still make it work, even virtually. If there are any questions or thoughts, you can feel free to email Jesse and I as Making Mensches, or reach out to us in the Q&A while we're still on, and I'll follow up with those resources. And I hope the rest of your Sunday is restful and full of love and community. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alana, Jesse, Ayelet. Thank you, everybody who's here. Mwah.
Thank you all so much for being so present for this conversation and letting me be a part of it.
Thanks for listening to Making Mensches. As an explicitly anti-Zionist grassroots org, we don't receive any institutional funding or support. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmensches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Mensches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Mensches, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.